Hello and welcome in to another episode of the Fantasy Football Forecast. I'm your host, Trevor Scott, doing a solo episode this Monday, set to talk about the Superflex 10-team 3-wide receiver draft strategy. Throughout most of this series, we've talked about draft rounds with the perspective of our league, right? That's 10 teams, it's Superflex, it has 3 wide receiver. That presents a significantly different draft strategy than 1 quarterback, 2 running back, 2 receiver, and a flex. So we're going to go through some of these things together here. And I have a couple mock drafts on how different builds turn out. But overall, right, I would like to pitch you on this idea. So that there's deeper starting rosters, right? There's 11 starters instead of 9. That's with a kicker and defense. So instead of having the first 7 rounds kind of fill out your starting lineup, and sometimes tight end goes before or after that, right? So it's 9 rounds really that fills out your starting lineup, and 8 excluding the tight end, which makes the draft a lot more important through 8 rounds than it otherwise would be. So I think that the depth in the starting lineup is definitely something that's worth it. And if you hit on a guy later in the draft, that becomes either your wide receiver 3 or you hit on a second quarterback, that becomes really good. Those things give you extra advantages instead of just having a really good bench player or having to replace somebody in your starting lineup who's also performing really well. That was, say, a 5th round pick. So I love that. I love the element of having more starters. It also generates more trade buzz, right? Because you can be trading guys that are like, in wide receiver 25 and actually have those be meaningful. So throughout the year, I think it really helps keep everybody engaged. And I think, you can gain significant advantages in the draft if you do hit late. Obviously, I touched on it just now, but the additional wide receiver emphasis is great, right? So the top end wide receivers are even that much more valuable, but also, those mid-tier receivers that are very consistent, like we've talked about a few of them on the series, like Jacoby Myers or Christian Kirk, those guys that aren't necessarily flashy, but that are consistent, don't have this huge upside, but are much more valuable in this sort of 3 wide receiver setup. So I really like that additional wide receiver value, and it makes them so that running back isn't so dominant, right? So you don't have to just go running back. The robust RB strategy in this sort of setup is much less advantageous than it is in other setups. So I really like that part of this roster construction as well. And also we use 6 bench players, and let me get into why I think 6 is the optimal amount and not to exceed 6, because then all of a sudden it makes it easier to keep additional quarterbacks, right? Which is what you don't necessarily want all the time, is for people to be storing 4 and 5 quarterbacks, deplete all of the quarterbacks off the waiver wire, which can still happen at times during the season. But for the most part, there's going to be players available when you have 6 bench spots at quarterback, because the additional flex spots that you need to be filling out in your starting lineup, you have to have guys on your bench that can also produce in those spots. So not only are you trying to improve your starting lineup, but when bye weeks or injuries hit, if you don't have deep position flexibility on your bench at running back, receiver, and even sometimes a backup tight end in 10-team leagues can be helpful if you're streaming tight end especially. And as you get through the year, maybe you pick up a defense for the following week, right? As you're kind of working on your roster construction, 6 bench really limits what you're able to do in terms of just stashing forever quarterbacks. So I think the 6 bench makes it so you don't have to make any additional quarterback rules. So you can just have it be how it is. And generally in 10 teams, there will still be a quarterback or 2. And sometimes even up to 5 starters available. And we see that in our league throughout, kind of fluctuate between 2 and 5 at any given time. So I really recommend the 6 bench. It's fun. It tightens up the rosters. It makes difficult decisions at the end of your roster, and obviously you're going to be thinking, I wish I could keep this guy, he's been on my roster. I don't want to cut him, but those end of roster decisions can be very important throughout the year. And so having to also add that as part of your week to week and season long strategy is also a very entertaining part of the game for this setup. Also, I've hammered this point home. We did a short on it. I've been saying it over and over. Following more quarterbacks is much more enjoyable from a fantasy perspective. When you have to follow 2 on your team and you're following guys on the other teams, it's just a lot more enjoyable of an experience when you're watching the games on Sundays. You know the players, you know who's good, you actually have to watch them in a meaningful way in terms of fantasy. So, when guys are coming up like Jordan Love last year, you know that they're good, and you know that somebody got a steal in the draft, and all of a sudden you're looking at a top 12, maybe top 15 player at the position in a way that you wouldn't otherwise. Same with like Brock Purdy, for example, last year, CJ Stroud. All of those guys ended up being single quarterback relevant, but in 2 QB leagues, they're all drafted. So that element of picking a guy that could explode is very, very fun from a prep standpoint and from an in season. If you do hit, or you get to see other teams improve in a way that you're trying to trade for those guys if you think they are legit early in the year. And there's just a lot more that opens up when you add that second quarterback position or that super flex position. So I went through a couple drafts here, and I'm going to kind of talk through what I did on each one. And I wanted to do this to display the different strategies. And when I say somebody goes in the 5th round, that would normally go in the 3rd. I don't want you to be thinking like, oh yeah, right, okay, that's the guy's never going there for my drafts. If you do transition more to a 2 QB or super flex format, these type of players will go in different areas than you're used to. So looking at this, right, I picked out of pick 6 with 2 quarterbacks, and I did all of these on Sleeper. If you're not familiar, the Sleeper mock draft room is open, and it has different draft settings that you can set for your mock draft, and one of them is a 2 QB setting. So it gives you the rankings of 2 QBs, and you can use those with a grain of salt, right? Depending on how your league drafts will change those rankings a little bit, right? Because each league is unique in its own way. And our league doesn't generally have a ton of quarterbacks go immediately. We still generally pick the top end, wide receivers and running backs a little earlier maybe than the ranking set would suggest. But a couple of those quarterbacks, we had 4 quarterbacks go in the first round in the first 10 picks last year, first 9 picks actually last year. So, they do start to go pretty quickly in general. So looking at the 6th pick, right, I picked Tyreek Hill in the first round. So I decided to get in on one of the receivers. I think 3 quarterbacks had gone before this. And then coming back around into the 2nd round, I'm really high on AJ Brown. If you haven't watched the wide receiver breakdown between AJ Brown, Garrett Wilson, and Puka Nacua, I highly recommend you go back and listen to our breakdown on those 3 guys. But AJ Brown is going to be a target in the 2nd round for me, and he's currently in 2 QB rankings, ranked at 18 on Sleeper. So that's going to be somebody I feel like I end up with a lot in the 2nd round. And then I don't normally do this, but for this, I wanted to just pick more traditionally, right? Not like super heavy wide receiver, not super heavy quarterback. And Jonathan Taylor fell to me I picked 26 in the 3rd round, and then Travis Etienne in the 4th round. So I was able to kind of get a more traditional setup here, even in Superflex, where I was able to get 2 running backs and 2 receivers in the first 4 rounds. So the top part of my lineup is kind of all secured here. And when you do that, you are going to feel behind on the 8 ball on quarterback, right? So you see, I got Goff in the 5th and Stafford in the 8th, right? And those aren't going to be top end quarterbacks. Ideally, they both push up into that high end QB2 range for this type of build. And if they do, and they're scoring anywhere between 18 to 20 points a week, you're going to be in good shape because of going in on the high end skill position players before them. So, and then, rounding out the rest of my roster, I got Mark Andrews in round 6. I have this as the 4th bullet point over here. Getting a tier 1 tight end in round 6 is something that I'm very comfortable with, and something that I will be planning to do throughout all my drafts that I have Superflex drafts in, because it's just difficult to rely on a tight end consistently, right? There are more options that feel like they're going to be good, like Evan Ingram and George Kittle, that you can get a little bit later than this, even Dalton Kincaid. But getting a top tier tight end in round 6 is something I'm very interested in, even if I haven't quite finished out my receivers, or haven't quite finished out my quarterbacks, or haven't quite finished out my running backs. So I'm in on Andrews in the 6th. I wouldn't push it much higher than that. I still, with needing 9 position players to fill out your roster here. It is a little bit difficult to go higher than that for Andrews, especially if you think one of those top 4 will fall. But 6th round for Andrews, I'm very confident with going here. And then rounding out the rest of the roster here, I have Amari Cooper, who I got in the 7th round. Obviously, with Deshaun Watson, he wasn't great last year, but I do have hope that a full off season together, and both of them coming into the year healthy, that they'll be able to have a good connection, and that he'll be worth a 7th round pick and worth a start every single week, right? That's ultimately what you're looking for in terms of player production when you're still drafting starters, is somebody that you feel has the potential to be locked and loaded starter. And then for my flex spot, I picked Calvin Ridley, but obviously I have a couple more options here with Zamir White, who is taking over as the lead back on the Raiders. We'll see as the offseason moves along if they sign anybody to compete with him. But if not, I expect that his draft position is going to get moved up a little bit anyways, because he was very productive at the end of last year. And then Christian Watson, who's overall very good. He's going to be the wide receiver 2 on the team now, because I think Jaden Reed kind of established himself last year as the 1. He was very productive as a rookie, and I think going into his 2nd year, he doesn't carry necessarily the boom bust, or so much anyways, of the boom bust nature and of the injury risk that comes with Watson. So I think I really like this roster. It's not necessarily my preferred roster setup, and we'll get into my preferred roster setup later. And we did a mock draft Monday where, I went heavy on wide receiver, which is my preferred setup in these leagues. So we'll get into that one in a little bit. But I do think that this team in particular turned out very well. The running backs felt like they fell to me in very appropriate positions where I felt like I was getting very good value there. I ended up with 2 in the top 10, which is not something that always will happen. So I'm hoping that the production from those spots, as long as they stay healthy, will be very high level production. Going over to another roster construction, this is the QB heavy construction. So if you don't necessarily think that there's going to be depth at the position, or you think that they're kind of all the same as you get outside the top 8, this is a roster construction that is for you. And especially if you think that you can mine talent late, or that you have receivers and running backs down in round 7, 8, and 9 that you really like, that you think are going to be productive, that you think are going to outperform those ADPs, or even all the way down into 12, 13, right? If you have these late round guys that you think, or you think during the year you're really good at putting together the receivers and the running backs better than you can the quarterbacks, this is the build that I recommend for you. So obviously going Hurts, 3rd overall, right? He's going to be the number 2 quarterback, I think, in most drafts. Allen and then him. I'd be surprised if anybody else really breaks into that. Maybe somebody goes Mahomes, maybe somebody goes Stroud, maybe somebody goes Lamar, depending. But, his rushing upside, all the touchdowns he scores on the ground, and he's got 2 elite weapons. They just signed Kellen Moore, so I think the passing game is even going to improve on what he's done in past years. So I'm very high on Jalen Hurts. I really think he could have an even higher ceiling this year than he has in the past. So I'm all in there, right? And I took him in the 1st round. And then looking down into the Superflex position, I went Dak in round 2. And, right, that's 18 overall. And I personally have Dak at QB7. I think he's been very productive. And I'm very excited about Dak because he didn't have any changes to his system and very few changes to the personnel. He's still got CeeDee Lamb. Jake Ferguson is there, another year more experience, and they still have Cooks. So I think that the offense should operate relatively similarly to the way it did last year, and that Dak is going to have all of the opportunity to succeed the same way he did last year. And he was QB3 overall last year. So I think he's ranked most places, 9, 10, something like that. And I think there's just fatigue on him, and there's media pressure on him from Dallas to win in the playoffs. And so he gets a bad rap, I think, as we go into every single draft season. But I really like Dak. So, right, you have 2 top 10 at least quarterbacks. I think 2 top 7 here. And that kind of opens up the door then for the rest of the draft to be able to attack any and all other positions. So Saquon fell to me at 23. So I went in on running back there. And for me, this is a very scary build because I like to get a lot of receivers early. So I definitely went receiver with my 4th, 5th picks here. I went Mike Evans and DJ Moore. Mike Evans, I think, is a great value in the 4th round. He was pushed down a lot, but he obviously outproduced that in a big way last year. And their offense also is very similar, right? All the skill position players, they signed Baker to a deal, so he'll be back. And I think Mike Evans, he's always 1,000 yards, so that's nice to have a floor like that. Scores a lot of touchdowns, big time red zone threat. So I think overall getting him as a wide receiver 1 is a little bit, well, it's obviously not what I prefer, so it's a little bit iffy, but I do like the fact that I got somebody that I think will be productive. And then DJ Moore, right? He showed what he could do with Justin Fields, and I think he's going to be the wide receiver 1 here. He's got multiple other weapons around him this year that I think are going to help prevent double teams on him. So I have a feeling that he could be very, very productive this year with Caleb Williams. Again, it's going to be one of those roulette type of situations where you're not sure on a week-to-week basis who's going to be producing in a bigger way between him and Keenan Allen. I think mostly Rome Odunze might get in there too for a couple big weeks where he's ends up with a top fantasy score, but overall I like Moore. And so you see how running back can kind of fill itself in here too, because I got Alvin Kamara in the 6th, which I think it was a little bit of a reach, for this draft, because I did want to fill in the running back spot that I thought was getting a little weaker before the receiver. And I ended up with Zay Flowers in the 7th anyways. So, a little bit of draft strategy there. Even if you like a player, make sure you secure the position that you think is starting to run out, or there's a tier break coming before the other position. If there's a couple guys at receiver that you like, and you can kind of afford to wait on that spot. So that's definitely just an overall strategy there. And then when it came back, I could have again waited on Kittle, but figuring that he's one of the last tight ends that gets drafted that I think is just going to be a set and forget every week. I do really like picking him down here in round 8. And then I just talked about him in the last mock, right? And Jaden Reed went to my flex spot at 9. So, and then Pollard and Mostert, right? My running backs are kind of weak. I got 4 starters at receivers, so I just wanted to make sure that I secured a couple more options at running back that could possibly replace Kamara or just injury insurance, all of the above here. So, just go recapping this one again, QB heavy, and you can see how the other positions are significantly weaker than the team I just showed you, right? And that's natural. That's going to happen coming out of the draft. You're not going to feel as good about your team at the wide receiver and running back positions if you go in on quarterback, but the quarterbacks give you such a high weekly floor. And if you have 2 really good ones, it also gives you an incredible stealing that if these guys score 30 points together on the same week, that's 60 points. And you generally in this setup want to get to like 120, 125. As an average score will generally get you in the range to get a win. So half of your points needed for that come from those 2 players. It's a very high upside way to play. And if some of these other guys hit, it's going to be specifically the wide receivers, it's going to be difficult to beat this team with the 2 good quarterbacks. So, overall, I think this team turned out really well too. I think I might have got a little lucky on the receivers. I think they might have gone a little bit earlier. And waiting on them until round 4 is something I'm just not all that comfortable with. But overall, I think the way that this team turned out for the build was very good. Okay, so going on to pick 7 here, and this is my preferred way to draft here. This is the wide receiver heavy setup in a 3 wide receiver Superflex. So, just right off the top, you can see Justin Jefferson, Garrett Wilson, Davante Adams, boom, boom, boom. Top 3 picks, all wide receivers, all guys that I think are going to be top 10 wide receivers, maybe Davante Adams top 12. But I do like the quarterback situation with Gardner Minshew a lot more for Davante Adams this year. So, and if it is Aidan O'Connell, I expect him to have outperformed Gardner Minshew. So I think that would elevate Adams's consistency and level of play this year. Garrett Wilson, we touched on in the AJ Brown, Garrett Wilson, and Puka Nacua video. I have very, very lofty expectations for Wilson with Rodgers back and healthy. So I think, we missed out on him breaking out in that way last year, but I'm right back in with a better offense all around him and with Rodgers healthy. Jefferson, no explanation needed there. And the quarterback has gotten worse, but that's why he's going in the middle of the first round now, or middle late first round in 2 QB leagues instead of first overall like he was last year. So I really love seeing the receivers be this good. And you can even see that I went Nico Collins in round 6 here. So I even filled the flex position before I had finished running back or quarterback. So I really like having a strong flex here too, if you can make it work with a receiver. And that's what I think I did here. I did say that I like Diggs over Nico, but I also said that because I was looking at ADPs, right, where Diggs was going after Nico. And Diggs went like a full round before Nico in this draft. So again, it's not that I didn't like Nico, and I don't think that he's going to have his weeks. I just think that at the ADP that I was going to pick Diggs. So that's why I ended up with Collins here. And then looking at how I did at quarterback, right? Obviously, when you wait, you're going to end up with worse quarterbacks than in the early QB strategy. So we have Lawrence and Cousins, both of who I think can perform with more upside, right? So there are going to be weeks with this build where Lawrence has 14 points or 12 points and Cousins has 10, and you're really going to need those receivers to push their totals up to win, right? Like that's going to be kind of how it works when your quarterbacks don't perform well. But there are going to be situations where Lawrence scores 25, right? And then Cousins backs it up with 18. And all of a sudden you don't even lose that much on your opponents in that given week, and the rest of your team doesn't need to do much to get a win. So, there is something to be said for quarterbacks that have a little bit more boom bust and that go a little later, that, when they do perform well, you're at a significant advantage in those weeks. So then I kind of framed it up to, like, obviously I didn't pick a running back until round 4, but this setup even can facilitate a hero RB approach. Because when you have quarterbacks and more receivers going in a format like this, somebody like Derrick Henry falls all the way down to, pick 34, I think is what it was here. Yeah, pick 34 overall. And it was a 4th round pick for me. And when I have Henry there, I don't have a lot of health concerns there. He's just so good. He's on an offense where he should score a lot of touchdowns. And getting that anchor at the position there made me feel confident that I could just go in on all the other positions, make sure I try and get the best player, the absolute best players I can everywhere else before I worry about even filling in running back the rest of the way, right? So getting Henry there just gives me a lot of confidence. I really like the pick in the 4th round, especially in a setup where he's your first, right? Like if you go even if you don't go receiver, if you go receiver, quarterback, and you get Henry as your first running back, I don't think there's a huge need to kind of fill in that second running back with any sort of urgency. Obviously, if you get a value or somebody falls to you, that's where you would want to go. But if you can kind of build out the rest of your team in this setup, that's something that I really like to do. So you can see that's kind of what I ended up doing here, right? I got Javonte Williams in the 9th, which I get there's a lot of concerns about Javonte Williams. I think we're going to get some additional information about the player specifically there in the situation. But overall, I think as long as he's still the lead back, I think he should be productive. And he is an additional year removed from that major knee injury. So coming into last year, right, I was completely out because he had that major knee injury, ACL, MCL. So, he could look good in camp. He could get some more passing game work. And there's a path anyways for him to exceeding his draft position, even if there is additional scenarios where the downside could be worse. But then also right here, you just keep going running backs as long as you can get starters. So I got Austin Eckler in the 10th and Devin Singletary in the 11th. Both of them obviously come with some major question marks. Like Eckler has Brian Thomas Jr. and Jaden Daniels has the rushing upside, so he might not see very many touchdowns in that offense, right? There's a lot of words there. Devin Singletary is going into a situation right now where he's kind of the only game in town. They lost over 300 touches with Saquon and with Matt Breida. And I think it's very interesting that he's going so low. And I think that's in anticipation of them signing somebody else. Because if he's going to be the sole running back there, I think his ADP, again, as we get closer to August, when they don't have anybody else on the team, I think he's another guy that'll get pushed up a little bit. Okay, so that's it for this team. This is my favorite setup for sure. I really like hammering wide receivers, and that's not to say that I go out of my way to like reach on these players, right? It's when they fall into a good spot where you're comfortable with it, and you have guys identified later in the draft that you like a quarterback, that you like a running back, and you feel comfortable, uh, getting your wide receiver set first. That's what I think. If that's your mentality, that's how you like to draft. That's what you should go after here. So the final draft strategy that I put together here is the robust RB strategy. And I'm not a fan of this strategy at all. This is my least favorite strategy personally. I don't like spending an abundance of draft capital into a position I feel like is by far the most injury prone. You have so many other positions that you have to fill out in your starting lineup. So it's just difficult for me to buy into this strategy. Now, the one time I think it's worth it, or I think you can explore it anyways. And the reason I had pick one here is because the time I feel like I would do this is if you have the first pick, or the second pick, and you end up drafting Christian McCaffrey, because then it's like you have such a major advantage at running back, right? That's the difference between him and number two is like the same as the number two down to 15 at running back. Like he is so far and away better than everybody else that I think it's an exception to the rule here at running back. Uh, so that's why I did it. That's why I did the strategy and the team with him on it. So obviously this is going to look very good from a robust RB strategy because he's going to be such an attractive option. Um, and then going down into the running backs, I just leaned into it right as part of this draft. Is in round two, I picked Jahmyr Gibbs, locked in a first quarterback, because if you don't get a quarterback in this strategy, you're going to be way behind on quarterback and you're already behind on receivers. So might as well grab a quarterback decently early, anchor that position, and then you can kind of bargain shop at the end of the QB2 tier. And then in that 4-5 turn, right, I went Josh Jacobs. That's down in the flex spot here to kind of complete or to highlight the robust RB approach, right? That's 3 out of your first 4 picks are running backs. Obviously, the running back position is going to look significantly better than it did in any other team that I showed you here. So, and getting a third one also covers you for one injury, right? So you can have other flex options on your bench especially if you hit on somebody later, like Deontay or Jalen Warren on this team, for example, end up becoming a player that can be started. That's going to help in the event of an injury, of an inevitable injury, I want to say, as upsetting as it is here. And then the wide receivers start in round 5, and I got Evans in round 5 here. We showed one earlier that was Evans in round 4. So I think it's pretty clear that I like him as a go-to. I think the floor is so important. I think drafting somebody that isn't going to be a miss here is so important. So that's why I feel like I have trended towards Mike Evans in these drafts. And then when it came back around, I felt very fortunate, very, very fortunate here that I got DK Metcalf in the 6th and Keenan Allen in 7th. That feels to me like I almost have a legitimate starting wide receiver core here with this strategy. And so for this team in particular, I really, really like this team. It's, Keenan Allen with the Chargers obviously had this massive target share, but before he got hurt, he was a top 3 wide receiver in fantasy last year. And he's going with Caleb Williams, and he's going to have to split with DJ Moore more than he did with anybody else on the Chargers. But there's a legitimate chance here that plays the same role where he's high volume, moving the chains, Caleb Williams safety blanket, and DJ Moore is more of the explosive player. And so I really like the pick here in round 7 for Keenan Allen. And, and then filling out the rest of the team here, just Aaron Rodgers in the 8th, making sure you get somebody in that 18 to 21 quarterback range that you like. And then Evan Ingram falling to the 9th felt like a blessing, right? I just went over that in the Jacksonville episode, that I think he should be drafted as tight end 5. I really like Evan Ingram this year. He had huge target volume. He's going to have another huge target volume with Calvin Ridley leaving. They brought in Brian Thomas Jr. obviously to kind of fill that role, but I expect that Ingram will be heavily relied on again this coming year. So I really like that part of the team. And then Deontay could be a target hog, not a great offense. So, there's a little bit upside there just because of how much volume he should be getting. And Jaylen Warren has the upside because of how explosive he is as a player, and because there's a chance anyways that he gets more work this year because of how good he was last year. And really, he didn't get a ton of volume, but he did a lot with his touches. He was, 30th running back in fantasy. And if he gets a little bit more volume, he can move up into the top 20 pretty easily, even without affecting Najee's workload too much. So that is the breakdown then. So I gave you 4 different draft strategies. I showed you kind of where these guys are going on Sleeper with the 2 QB setting picked. And I really like doing these mocks. I really like trying out different strategies and seeing which ones you prefer. And, there's going to be all kinds of data on what's worked in the past, right? There's going to be, when you picked your first running back, what percentage of those teams went to the playoffs and all that stuff. And I understand from a draft perspective that you want to increase your odds in a way that is advantageous to the overall population. But I do think also that there's a little bit of year-to-year bias that goes into that. And also depends on how your league mates do in the draft. And it depends on which players you're drafting at that time too, because it's not necessarily just that you took a running back. Like 2 years ago, it was like that running back had to be Josh Jacobs because he was so good 2 years ago, right? And so there's a little bit of player-to-player bias that I think gets into that data, that I think it's more important to try to identify which players you like and where you can get those players. And so the more you can mock and the more you practice different builds and see which ones work for you, see which ones build the best team in your mind, is the way that you should try to practice and prepare for your drafts. So with that, thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow with the start of the AFC East, and we'll be reviewing the Buffalo Bills. Thank you so much for watching.